Dubrow Suspicion Files.
Welcome back to the deep dive. Our mission here is to take complex, overwhelming evidence and, well, filter it down to the essential truth, giving you the shortcut to being well-informed.
And today we are tackling a case that is, truly a case study in ambiguity.
Absolutely. It's a story that has fundamentally warped American criminal justice history. The 2001 death of Kathleen Peterson in Durham, North Carolina.
It's mandatory reading for anyone who wants to understand the limitations and sometimes the outright failures of forensic science when it meets the pressure of a high-stakes murder trial.
The basic scene is this. Kathleen Peterson was found dead at the bottom of a narrow, poorly lit service staircase in her home.
But the scene itself was just a tableau of violence, an immense amount of blood. Paramedics described it as looking like a massacre.
Right, and that's where we hit the central scientific riddle that makes this case so maddening and so perfect for a deep dive. It's what we're calling the forensic paradox.
And that paradox is, on its face, simple, but it's incredibly profound. You had deep, soft tissue damage. We're talking multiple severe lacerations on her scalp, massive blood loss, all of which suggests extreme, sustained violence.
A brutal beating.
Exactly, a beating. Yet beneath all that damaged soft tissue, the skeletal structure was utterly intact.
So wait, let me get this straight. Wounds that look like she was hit repeatedly with a heavy object.
But zero skull fractures, zero subdural hematomas. The evidence was speaking two completely different languages at the same time.
So you have this pattern of injury screaming brutal beating, but then the lack of underlying damage suggests a low-mass, non-crushing kind of event.
Precisely. And neither the state's simple homicide narrative nor the defense's claim of a straightforward fall could easily explain that contradiction.
And as I'm sure many of you know, this whole ordeal gained global notoriety through the docuseries The Staircase,
which really laid bare all the issues at the heart of this legal battle. We're talking about the subjective application of forensic pathology, the disastrous reliability of bloodstain pattern analysis, especially when it's handled by biased experts.
and just the systemic failure that happens when confirmation bias takes the reins right at the start of an investigation.
It truly became a crucible, testing the integrity of the entire system.
So on one side, you have the state's theory. Her husband, Michael Peterson, had bludgeoned his wife to death, period.
Then the defense, which maintained it was a tragic, albeit very complicated, accidental fall.
But we are also here to rigorously analyze the third, scientifically distinct and, frankly, a much less dramatic narrative.
The avian attack, or the controversial owl theory.
Our mission today is to take the entirety of the evidentiary record and really scrutinize all three of these narratives. We're not here for convenience. We're looking for the theory that achieves the highest consistency with all of the physical evidence, especially those bizarre forensic paradoxes.
So where do we start?
Okay, let's unpack this. We have to start with the night of December 9, 2001. The whole foundation of the state's case is built on reconstructing a timeline, and it all centers on one critical 45-minute window.
Right. This is Michael Peterson's own account of the evening. He and Kathleen had been celebrating a career success of hers, I think. They'd had a good amount of wine, some champagne.
They rented a movie, America's Sweethearts. Pretty normal evening.
A very normal evening. Peterson claimed that around 2 a.m., Kathleen went inside. He said she was preparing for a crucial conference call the next morning.
And he stayed outside.
He stayed outside by the pool.
By the pool, in December, in North Carolina. Now, the prosecution really hammered on this detail.
They did. And the sources do note the weather had been unseasonably mild earlier in the evening, but by 2 a.m., the temperature was dropping significantly.
And he claimed he was out there for a full 45 minutes.
45 minutes, yes, to finish his drink and smoke a pipe.
And that 45-minute period where he was completely unwitnessed is when all of this happened. That's when the fatal injuries were sustained.
According to his testimony, he finally came inside, and that's when he says he discovered Kathleen at the foot of the service stairs.
Which brings us right to the 911 calls. It's not just the content of the calls, but the timing and the structure of the communication that's so important.
The first call came in at 2:40 a.m. Peterson reported an accident. His words were, "My wife had an accident. She fell down the stairs. She is still breathing."
He sounds distraught, obviously, but still relatively coherent, if that's the right word. Panicked.
He does. And linguistic experts, they analyzed that call intensely. Some flagged his immediate use of that passive voice at an accident as potential distancing language.
Meaning he's creating a story rather than reacting to a fresh trauma.
That was the argument. But to be fair, the sources also point out that in moments of extreme shock, people often revert to simple, almost rehearsed-sounding phrases to communicate. So drawing a definitive conclusion from the language alone is, it's very difficult.
But then it gets stranger. Just 6 minutes later, at 2:46 a.m., the dynamic changes completely.
Yes. Peterson calls back. And now he is absolutely frantic. He's shouting, "She is not breathing. She is not breathing. Please come quickly."
And the prosecution argued that the 6-minute gap was incredibly suspicious.
Highly suspicious. They saw it as potentially staged. Why call back specifically to confirm she was no longer breathing? It felt to them like he was trying to preemptively cover for the fact that she would be found dead and not breathing when help arrived.
But the really critical evidence that just completely shredded Peterson's timeline wasn't linguistic at all. It was physical, something the first responders saw immediately.
Right. When the paramedics arrived, they found Kathleen crumpled at the bottom of the stairs, surrounded by that massive pool of blood.
And here's the one fact that instantly contradicted his claim of having just found her.
The paramedic, James Rose, provided crucial testimony. He stated that much of the blood surrounding Kathleen was not wet. It wasn't fresh or flowing.
It was wet.
It was already dry, coagulated, or clotted.
That detail is just immense. Blood takes a significant amount of time to dry, especially a large pool of it on a hardwood floor.
A very long time. If that blood was already coagulated, the injury must have happened far, far earlier than that 2:40 a.m. 911 call, potentially hours earlier.
So this one observation strongly suggests Peterson delayed calling for help.
It does. I mean, if he really did find her at 2:40 a.m., then she had to have been injured much, much earlier. Maybe closer to that 2 a.m. mark when she first went inside.
This isn't necessarily proof of homicide, but it's powerful evidence against his version of events. It implies he was either covering up the time of the injury, or maybe he reacted to the fall initially in a way he just couldn't publicly admit.
And we should also note the immediate failure of the investigators to properly secure the scene. This just compounded every single forensic analysis that followed.
How so?
Peterson was allowed to embrace the body, which could have transferred blood and contaminated any potential trace evidence. His son, Todd, also entered the scene, possibly tracking blood through the house.
So a compromised scene from the get-go.
Completely. The stairwell wasn't even taped off until 3:34 a.m., almost a full hour after the initial call. And the sheer visual chaos of the scene, that huge amount of blood, the high-velocity spatter on the walls, it immediately drove the investigators toward a homicide conclusion.
So they saw a spatter they thought couldn't come from a simple fall.
And they instantly assumed a swinging weapon was involved. The seed of the homicide theory wasn't planted by careful forensic analysis. It was planted by the shocking visual presentation of the scene itself.
Which takes us to the truly confounding scientific data. Let's dive into the autopsy paradox, because this is where the core scientific riddle of the case really takes shape.
The autopsy, performed by Dr. Deborah Radish, became the battleground. Her findings centered on the 7 deep lacerations on the posterior, or the back, of Kathleen Peterson's scalp.
And she confirmed these were lacerations, not incisions, right? So tears, not clean cuts.
Exactly. Tears caused by blunt force impact. They were complex, multidirectional, and they extended deep, reaching the pericranium.
And the pericranium is the dense membrane that covers the skull bone itself.
That's the one. So these were very, very deep wounds.
The prosecution immediately weaponized this number, 7. Their argument was, on its face, pretty simple.
It was. They argued it is physically impossible for a person falling down a set of stairs to strike their head 7 distinct times in different locations on the back of their skull.
That number, they said, just had to mean multiple deliberate impacts from a swinging object.
Right. And the defense had to get, well, very creative to counter this. They proposed that in a complex, uncontrolled fall down that narrow wooden stairwell with all its sharp edges, the head could strike the steps or the door frame repeatedly.
They introduced this idea of shearing or avulsion trauma,
which is where the skin tears and separates from the underlying tissue when it hits a sharp edge at speed and at an angle. It can mimic multiple impacts, even if there's only 1 or 2 main points of contact.
It's a tough sell, but I guess it was necessary to present a mechanism of injury that didn't involve an attacker.
It was. But the real problem for the prosecution, the scientific wall they just kept hitting, was the 0 fracture anomaly.
This is what you mentioned at the top. The profound implications of having 7 deep, violent scalp wounds with absolutely no underlying damage to the skull.
This is the centerpiece of the defense's entire argument, and honestly, the most exculpatory piece of evidence for Michael Peterson. Despite the severity of that soft tissue trauma, there were no fractures to the skull, no subdural hematomas,
So no bleeding on the brain?
no bleeding on the brain, and no direct contusions to the brain tissue itself.
And the defense experts, including Dr. Werner Spitz, who is one of the most respected forensic pathologists in the world, he went on record calling this scenario forensically unprecedented.
That phrase is just so powerful. Dr. Spitz testified that in cases where death results from a severe beating with a rigid metal object, which is what the state was proposing at the time, skull fractures are present in nearly 100% of cases.
So the only way to cause that much deep tearing of the scalp without fracturing the bone beneath it
Is if the impacting object lacked the heavy mass or the rigidity to actually crush the bone. The force was somehow confined entirely to just tearing the scalp.
It just fundamentally reframes the whole question of force, doesn't it? If you swing a heavy, rigid object with enough force to kill someone with 7 blows, the bone should give way.
It should. The fact that it didn't suggest the trauma was delivered by something sharp but lightweight, or delivered with much less mass than a typical bludgeoning weapon.
We also need to touch on the small injury to Kathleen's neck. There was a fracture to the thyroid cartilage.
A very small fracture, yes, to the superior cornu of the left thyroid cartilage. The superior cornu is a tiny, upward-pointing horn on the cartilage, basically the structure just above the voice stalks.
And the prosecution immediately interpreted this as evidence of attempted strangulation.
Of course they did. It fit their narrative of deliberate violence perfectly.
But the defense had a counter for this, too.
A very compelling one. The introduced literature that shows this specific small fracture can easily happen accidentally if the neck or throat strikes the sharp edge of a stair during an uncontrolled fall.
So it's a documented phenomenon in fall cases.
It is, which completely removes its definitive status as proof of an assault.
Then there was this highly technical, kind of in-the-weeds debate over the exact time of death, which all centered on a microscopic finding in the brain tissue: red neurons.
Right. Red neurons are what's called a histological marker. You can see them under a microscope, and they indicate that neurons have died due to oxygen deprivation or hypoxia.
And Dr. Thomas Bolden, testifying for the state, he asserted that for these neurons to appear, you need at least 2 hours of this hypoxia.
At least 2 hours. And if they took 2 hours to form, that backed the state's whole theory that Peterson had found her, waited hours, and only called 911 when he was certain she was about to die.
So the doctors couldn't save her.
Correct. But here's the problem with that. The defense introduced scientific literature showing that in cases where the victim is dying a slow death from exsanguination, massive blood loss, these red neurons can appear in as little as 30 minutes.
Wow. So that completely undermines the state's claim of a multi-hour cover-up. It's actually consistent with Peterson's 45-minute window.
It is. It confirms a slow death from bleeding, which aligns with his timeline, but not the state's narrative of a deliberate delay.
This brings us to what many observers point to as the first major red flag of prosecutorial overreach: the controversy around the official cause of death.
Dr. Radish ultimately certified the cause as blunt force trauma of the head.
Yes, but the sources suggest she was under immense pressure to write that.
The sources strongly indicate that her initial consideration was exsanguination blood loss from those deep scalp wounds as the primary mechanism of death.
Let's just clarify that for you listening. Dr. Radish's initial objective finding death by bleeding out was perfectly consistent with a severe fall where someone could bleed to death from complex scalp lacerations.
But the sources suggest she was then persuaded or pressured to change that finding to blunt force trauma, because that term fit the murder narrative the district attorney's office was already building.
And that distinction is absolutely vital for a jury. Death by blood loss sounds like an unfortunate accident. Death by blunt force trauma implies a deliberate, forceful, and repeated action.
Exactly. This alleged shift, moving from a potentially accidental cause to a definite assault cause, it just casts a shadow over the objectivity of the entire initial forensic report, and it really fuels the later allegations that the whole investigation was suffering from confirmation bias right from the start.
So if the science was so contradictory, with no weapon found and a timeline that was disputed by the paramedics themselves, how on earth did the state manage to secure conviction in 2003?
It really came down to narrative construction and just the relentless pursuit of motive.
The prosecution, led by DA Jim Hardin and the very charismatic and aggressive EDF Rita Black, they built their case on what they called the beatings hypothesis.
But to do that, They desperately needed a plausible murder weapon, one that could explain the lacerations without requiring the fractures that weren't there.
And that's where they introduced the infamous blowpoke.
Yes, the hollow brass fireplace tool that was conspicuously absent from the Peterson fireplace set.
Rhetorically, it was a very clever strategy.
It was. The state argued that because the blowpoke was thin, hollow, and relatively light, it could be swung like a whip, causing those deep, clean lacerations when the brass edges struck the scalp.
And crucially, they argued its lack of heavy mass was what explained why the underlying skull was spared. It was a neat, tailored solution to the forensic paradox.
It was the perfect story. Until it wasn't.
Because this entire theory just completely collapsed in the most dramatic way possible during the defense presentation.
I mean, it was incredible. The missing blowpoke was discovered, not hidden in the woods somewhere, but tucked away in the Peterson garage.
Found by his son, Clayton.
And critically, it was covered in undisturbed cobwebs, dust, and insect debris. Forensic testing confirmed it. No blood, no DNA on the tool.
This definitively proved the blowpoke had not been used, moved, or cleaned in a very, very long time.
That should have been the end of the state's case. You build your entire case around a specific murder weapon, and then the weapon turns up, completely pristine and unused.
It was a catastrophic blow, but the prosecution refused to give up.
They didn't. They just pivoted. They suggested that either the recovered tool was a decoy, or that Peterson had disposed of the real weapon and used a different blowpoke or a similar object.
So they just continued to rely on the blowpoke theory to explain the injuries, even when the specific object they named was completely exonerated by the evidence.
Exactly. And when you lack a physical weapon, you have to rely on motive. And the state hammered away at two main areas: finance and character.
Let's start with the financial pressure.
The sources outlined pretty significant financial strain. The Petersons had $143,000 in credit card debt. The prosecution described them as house poor, despite their large property.
So the motive presented was simple: money.
A $1.4 million life insurance policy on Kathleen. The prosecution argued Peterson needed that payout to maintain his lifestyle and manage his debt.
But the motive that arguably sealed the conviction, and one that really tapped into deep-seated prejudices in the early 2000s, was the discovery of Michael's secret life.
This was a bombshell. Investigators found thousands of images of male pornography and ongoing email communications with a male escort who went by the name Brad.
And this evidence was used to create the narrative of a violent confrontation.
Absolutely. ADF Frida Black's closing arguments were legendary for their homophobic rhetoric. She framed Peterson's bisexuality and secret life as inherently deceitful. I think her exact words were pure tea-filth.
And she argued that Kathleen must have discovered this, leading to a violent argument that ended in murder.
We have to just pause and reflect on the impact that kind of character assassination would have had on a jury back then, especially when the physical evidence was so weak.
The goal wasn't just to prove financial need, it was to fundamentally undermine Peterson's moral character, using his secret life as this powerful emotional weapon in the courtroom.
It filled the scientific vacuum left by the missing, unused blowpoke. When the physical evidence is confusing, a jury often defaults to finding the person they dislike or distrust the most.
And Peterson's perceived deceit over his sexuality gave the state the emotional underpinning they needed.
And then, on top of all that, there was the introduction of the Elizabeth Ratliff case. This just elevated the motive from a one-off crime of passion to a supposed common scheme.
This was essentially a trial within a trial, and it was designed purely to prejudice the jury into believing Peterson was capable of a repeat offense.
Elizabeth Ratliff was a family friend of the Petersons when they were living in Germany. In 1985, she died after a fall down a staircase.
And crucially, her death had been investigated by German authorities and ruled as natural causes, a cerebral hemorrhage.
Right. Peterson was the last person to see her alive, so he was present for the initial investigation, but was never, ever implicated.
What's astonishing is the extreme measure the state took to bring this evidence into the trial.
It's unbelievable. They got the highly controversial legal permission to exhume Ratliff's body from her grave in Germany and transport it all the way to North Carolina.
And Dr. Radish, the same medical examiner who did Kathleen's autopsy, performed the second autopsy on Ratliff.
And the result was just an eerie, almost unbelievable echo. Dr. Radish reclassified Ratliff's death as a homicide by blunt force trauma, citing once again multiple deep scalp lacerations.
The exact same pattern found on Kathleen.
The exact same pattern. The state's implication was undeniable. Peterson had killed before, using the same means, staged it as a fall, and gotten away with it.
This evidence was allowed under North Carolina's rules of evidence to suggest a common scheme or pattern of behavior, but the sources describe it as highly prejudicial.
Incredibly so. There was no definitive evidence linking Peterson to causing Ratliff's death, only that he was there when it happened. But it served its purpose. It cemented the narrative that Peterson was a dangerous, serial liar who had covered up deaths on stairs before.
So, if the state's narrative was driven by a non-existent weapon and character assassination, let's look at the defense's counter-narrative. They had the very tough job of using the simple mechanics of an accident to explain those 7 highly complex lacerations.
The defense's core argument was that this was just a tragic confluence of circumstances. You have Kathleen with a blood alcohol content of 0.07.
So just under the legal driving limit, but enough to impair balance.
Right. Plus Valium in her system. She was wearing unstable flip-flops, trying to navigate narrow, steep stairs in the dark. All the elements for a severe accident were there.
They relied heavily on biomechanical modeling to propose their central mechanism, which required this complex sequence of events they called the double fall scenario.
Scenario 1 was Kathleen slipping backward and hitting her head initially on the doorframe or the edge of a step. This caused the first set of lacerations and subsequent momentary unconsciousness.
They had to account for all that blood, so the initial lacerations had to be severe.
Exactly. Then Scenario 2 kicks in. She revives a short time later. She's disoriented. She attempts to stand up in the slick, bloody mess that the first fall created. She slips again and strikes her head a second time, exacerbating the trauma and causing the rest of the lacerations.
Hold on. 2 separate consecutive falls down the same narrow staircase, both resulting in a total of 7 distinct scalp lacerations, both perfectly timed to happen after she revives from the first impact. I mean, doesn't that sound more fantastical than the murder theory it was trying to replace?
It absolutely strains credulity. It does. But the defense was forced into this complex explanation because the injuries were so specific and so numerous. They had to account for those 7 distinct points of impact without an assailant.
And the only way to do that was to assume multiple points of contact from the environment itself, the edges of the stairs and the doorframe.
The defense also had to directly refute the blood spatter evidence, which the state claimed was the smoking gun proving the beating.
And this is where they brought in the big gun, Dr. Henry Lee, arguably the most famous forensic scientist of his era.
Dr. Lee's testimony was critical. The state's experts had claimed the high spatter on the walls was cast off from a weapon being swung over and over.
But Dr. Lee argued that the spatter patterns were instead consistent with the victim coughing and aspirating blood while she was struggling to breathe. He called it expectoration.
Can you just clarify that distinction for us? How does coughing up blood create a pattern that an expert could mistake for cast off from a beating?
Well, when a person is bleeding that profusely from deep scalp wounds, the blood can run down their face and into their mouth, or they can aspirate it from their lungs if the injuries are severe enough to compromise their breathing. So when they cough or gasp for air, that's the expectoration, tiny droplets of blood are forcefully projected outward. And depending on the force and the trajectory, this can create spatter patterns that, to an untrained or, a biased eye, can resemble the patterns from a weapon being swung.
So the defense was arguing that the violence you see this scene was the result of a severe, prolonged bleeding injury and Kathleen's slow, agonizing death by exsanguination.
And not the cause of the injuries being a deliberate beating.
Exactly. Lee also suggested that patterns the prosecution called cast-off could simply be the result of bloody hair movement as Kathleen thrashed or tried to move in that narrow space.
So it was a direct scientific challenge to the state's key forensic interpretation. He was arguing that the blood evidence was completely consistent with a violent but accidental death.
And yet, despite these crucial scientific challenges from the defense, the state still secured that conviction in 2003.
So let's talk about what ultimately destroyed that verdict. The complete collapse of its scientific foundation, personified by the Duane Deaver scandal.
This is a textbook case of forensic tragedy driven by confirmation bias. The 2003 conviction was overwhelmingly dependent on the testimony of SBI agent Duane Deaver, the state's bloodstain pattern analysis expert.
Without Deaver's confident assertion that the blood proved beating, the prosecution's case just didn't have the link it needed between Peterson and the violence.
Deaver's key testimony hinged on one single tiny drop of blood on the inside cuff of Michael Peterson's shorts. He claimed this was transferred during the beating.
And he presented this as proof positive that Peterson was standing directly over Kathleen, inflicting these repeated blows.
And to prove this point, Deaver performed a series of experiments that became infamous as the fraudulent stomp test.
Right. But the sources reveal just an utter lack of scientific methodology here. This wasn't just poor science. It was manipulation.
It was manipulation designed to achieve a predetermined outcome. Deaver conducted dozens of these tests, beating blood-soaked sponges, transferring blood with different things. It was later revealed that he only recorded the results that fit the prosecution's theory.
And all the tests that failed to produce the spatter they wanted.
Destroyed. Or never documented.
And the most damning revelation, the thing that really exposed the intent, was the video evidence.
Yes. The later investigation found video footage showing Deaver and his team literally high-fiving after they finally achieved the specific high-velocity spatter pattern they needed to support the murder narrative.
That is not the behavior of objective forensic scientists.
Not at all. That is an investigative team celebrating the successful fabrication of evidence to support their bias.
He also failed to document any of the essential variables, the force he used, the angle of impact, the volume of blood, any of it.
Which made his tests scientifically worthless, yet they were presented to the jury as infallible proof.
And the systemic corruption went far beyond just the Peterson case.
A massive independent audit of the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation, the SBI Blood Lab, was launched in 2010, and it revealed just breathtaking failures of professionalism and ethics.
That audit found that Deaver had misrepresented or falsified evidence in 34 cases across the state. It led to chaos, overturned convictions.
Including the case of Greg Taylor, who served 17 years in prison for a murder he did not commit, based almost entirely on Deaver's junk science.
And in the Peterson case specifically, we learned Deaver actively withheld exculpatory evidence.
The audit confirmed he had performed Lumelite testing, a chemical test to detect latent blood on Michael Peterson's shirt.
And the results were negative for blood spatter, which directly contradicted his testimony that Peterson was covered in high-velocity spatter from the attack.
And Deaver just kept that negative report hidden from the defense team.
Withholding exculpatory evidence that proves innocence or undercuts the state's theory, is one of the most severe ethical and legal violations an investigator can commit.
And the outcome was sealed when Judge Orlando Hudson found that Deaver had perjured himself repeatedly. Not just about his tests, but about his own experience, grossly inflating his qualifications from just a handful of cases to claiming over 500.
The destruction of Deaver's credibility just obliterated the foundation of that 2003 homicide conviction.
And it led directly to the verdict being vacated and the order for a new trial in 2011. The state's main narrative had collapsed under the weight of its own deception.
So with the two traditional narratives, homicide and accidental fall, both struggling under the totality of the evidence, we are compelled to look at the third, highly unconventional theory that emerged specifically to solve the paradox.
The owl theory.
The owl theory.
This theory, which was developed by a local attorney named Larry Pollard, it emerged not from some gut feeling or emotion, but as a scientific attempt to find a single elegant mechanism that explains the three core anomalies: the deep lacerations, the zero fractures, and the presence of outdoor debris inside that stairwell.
Let's talk about the ecological context here, because we're not talking about a small garden bird. We're talking about the barred owl, Strix varia. It's an apex avian predator, and it's very common in the Durham area.
They are large, they are aggressive, and critically, they are highly territorial, especially during their breeding season, which peaks around December.
And there are documented the rare cases of barred owls attacking humans.
Yes, and they also always strike the head during a swooping attack to ward off what they perceive as a threat to their territory.
The genius of this theory is how the attack mechanics of an owl perfectly resolved the forensic paradox that stumped the entire prosecution. Can you explain that resolution again for us?
So when a large raptor, like a barred owl, strikes, it uses its talons. An owl's talons are enormous. They are incredibly sharp, and they're designed for piercing and slicing prey. They can exert massive grip pressure upwards of 300 psi.
But they lack the sheer mass of a hammer or a metal blowpoke.
Exactly. If we use that egg analogy, a hammer, representing blunt force, hits an egg and it crushes the shell, the skull. An owl's talons, however, are like a series of incredibly sharp spikes.
So they can pierce and slice the scalp, the soft tissue, deeply and repeatedly, acting like knives and causing those 7 deep lacerations.
But because the talons and the bird itself lack the necessary heavy, rigid mass, they do not have the crushing impact energy required to shatter or even crack the underlying bone,
The force is dissipated entirely in the soft tissue.
creating the lacerations without the fractures.
That is the most scientifically integrated explanation for the 7 lacerations and the 0 fracture anomaly we have encountered so far. And what's fascinating here is how this theory integrates all these seemingly minor trace details that the prosecution either ignored or just dismissed as contamination.
The morphology of the wounds themselves was the first clue. Ornithological experts noted that the lacerations on Kathleen's scalp often appeared in a trident-like pattern, with 3 distinct limbs converging.
And that shape is consistent with.
Exactly, consistent with the spread of an owl's talons upon impact.
Then there's the most compelling physical, unexplained piece of evidence, the microscopic feather.
A microscopic feather fragment was found deep within a clump of Kathleen's hair. And crucially, that hair had been pulled out by the roots, which indicates she had actively torn it out during a frantic physical struggle.
Suggesting she had clutched onto whatever was attacking her, it's highly unlikely she would have pulled a feather from a down pillow and clutched it with that much force.
And we know this struggle had to have occurred outdoors because of the botanical debris found stuck to her.
Right. Investigators found pine needles and cedar needles stuck to her hands and in her hair. This debris immediately places the struggle outdoors, near the pine and cedar trees that surrounded the Peterson property.
There was even a sliver of a tree limb noted on her body. These details completely contradict the state's indoor bludgeoning theory and the defense's strictly indoor fall.
And if the attack started outside, then the blood found outside makes perfect sense. That was another anomaly.
Yes. Drops of blood were found on the front walkway leading to the house, and a smear of blood was found on the exterior of the front door.
Which is entirely consistent with Kathleen being attacked outside, becoming disoriented and injured, running blindly into the house to escape, bleeding as she went, and then stumbling and falling down the stairs in her compromised, bloody state.
Furthermore, experts analyzed other minor injuries that the prosecution had just dismissed. Small wounds on her face and elbows.
And what did they find?
Veterinary experts, including a Dr. Patrick Rettig from the University of Minnesota Raptor Center, examined the photos and concluded these small wounds were consistent with beak pecks and talon punctures. Secondary injuries from a raptor attack. Not typical defensive wounds from warding off human blows, which usually involve severe bruising to the forearms or injuries to the palms.
It is genuinely incredible that a theory that explains the scientific paradoxes so cleanly was dismissed for so long.
Well, again, it just speaks to the power of confirmation bias. Ornithological experts, including Dr. Carla Dove, the Smithsonian Institution's leading feather identification expert, she reviewed the injuries and concluded the patterns were very much like those made by a raptor's talons.
But the idea was simply too bizarre, too disruptive to the entrenched murder narrative for investigators to seriously pursue it early on.
It was. But the theory does have one critical weakness. A failure of the initial homicide-focused investigation that just cannot be undone.
The missing DNA link.
The missing DNA link.
Yeah.
While that microscopic feather was compelling, the ability to definitively link that fragment to a Strix varia via genetic testing was lost during that crucial initial phase.
Had that feather been identified as coming from an owl, the entire case would have changed instantly.
Instantly. But without that genetic identification, critics of the theory can still argue the feather was just contamination from a pillow or the environment, even though that fails to explain the pine needles and the physical pattern of the lacerations.
Okay, so let's synthesize everything we've talked about. We have 3 competing theories, and we need to use a kind of consistency matrix to see which one stands up best against these anomalies.
We have to hold each theory against the forensic evidence, not just the emotional story. So take the 7 deep lacerations combined with the 0 fracture anomaly.
The homicide theory is highly inconsistent because that kind of bludgeoning requires bone trauma.
The accidental fall strains credulity, requiring those 2 perfectly specific consecutive impacts.
But the owl theory is highly consistent. It explains the lacerations from the talons without the mass for the fractures.
Okay, next, the trace evidence. The feathers, the pine needles, the cedar needles, the tree limb fragment.
Both the homicide theory and the accidental fall have to just dismiss all of that as inconvenient contamination or some weird anomaly.
The owl theory, however, finds this evidence directly corroborative. It places the struggle outside, exactly where the attack would have begun.
And the blood on the walkway and the front door exterior. Inconsistent with an indoor beating, unless there was some extensive, complex staging.
But it's highly consistent with the owl theory. an injured, disoriented victim running inside after an outdoor attack, which then precipitates the fall.
So the overall analysis shows that the homicide theory was built on circumstantial evidence, a non-existent weapon, and perjured testimony. And it failed the zero fracture test.
The accidental fall required an improbable series of events to explain the multiple injuries.
And the owl theory emerges as the single mechanism that successfully bridges that zero fracture paradox and accounts for the otherwise inexplicable outdoor trace evidence.
Despite the overwhelming scientific inconsistencies of the original verdict, the case did eventually reach a legal conclusion in 2017, and this was largely driven by the fallout from the Dow scandal.
What was the situation leading to that final bizarre legal maneuver?
Well, following the exposure of Deaver's misconduct and the vacating of the conviction, the state was in a terrible position. They lacked their key forensic evidence, and they had serious doubts about securing a conviction in a new trial.
Especially with the owl theory gaining mainstream plausibility.
Right. And Michael Peterson, having already spent 8 years in prison, was aging, he was financially drained, and he did not want to risk another years-long, costly jury trial. It was a complete, mutually exhausting legal stalemate.
Which brought about the use of the Alford plea. This is a legal maneuver that is constantly misunderstood. Can you walk us through the technicality of how he can maintain his innocence while pleading guilty?
The Alford plea is a unique mechanism in U.S. law. It allows a defendant to plead guilty to a charge. In Peterson's case, it was voluntary manslaughter, while simultaneously maintaining their factual innocence.
So he did not admit to committing the act of killing his wife.
He did not.
Then why accept the plea at all if he's innocent?
By taking the Alford plea, Peterson legally acknowledged that the state possessed sufficient evidence, despite all its flaws, like the Ratliff case and the circumstantial motive, that could likely secure a conviction from a jury.
So in essence, he chose to accept the conviction to avoid the risk of a life sentence in a second trial. It ends the litigation immediately while still letting him publicly deny he did it.
It's a pragmatic legal decision to prioritize freedom over the financial and psychological risk of prolonged litigation.
He was sentenced to 86 months in prison for voluntary manslaughter.
But having already served 89 months, 3 months more than his sentence, he was released immediately on February 24, 2017.
So he is legally a convicted felon because he accepted the plea, but he remains free and steadfast in his denial of guilt.
A stance the Alford plea legally allows him to maintain.
This case is just such a stark illustration of the conflict between a compelling, emotionally charged narrative sex, deceit, financial desperation, and objective, sometimes bizarre science.
It seems highly probable that Kathleen Peterson was the victim of a rare, violent interaction with nature, a perfect storm biological accident that simply looked exactly like murder to the human eye, an eye that was already primed for scandal and violence.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the tragedy lies not just in Kathleen's death, but in the profound failure of the justice system in North Carolina to objectively investigate alternatives once that early, emotionally charged homicide narrative took hold.
Absolutely. Locking onto a preferred theory, fabricating evidence to support it, and using prejudicial character assassination, as we saw with Deaver and the Frida Black rhetoric, it prevented the truth from emerging for decades and put an innocent man through a decade of legal torment.
The systemic failure here is a crucial lesson in how confirmation bias and just relying on dubious expertise can completely derail justice, turning a probable accident into an unsolvable murder mystery.
The microscopic feather in Kathleen Peterson's hand really does remain the enduring symbol of this entire case. It's a tiny, easily overlooked piece of truth buried deep under an avalanche of bias and bad science. A detail that, if it had been investigated properly at the outset, might have changed everything.
And it raises the question for all of us, whether we're analyzing a legal case or just facing a barrage of daily information. When you are faced with information overload or a highly compelling emotional story, how can you ensure you are looking past the easy answers and actively searching for that small, overlooked piece of evidence, the microscopic feather that might reveal the hidden truth? That is the real challenge the Peterson case presents to critical thinking.